The stagecoach rattled off down the road, its wheels sending up a cloud of dust that drifted across the open plain until it vanished into the wide Montana sky. Clara Dawes stood alone at the side of the road, a small trunk at her feet and a letter folded tight in her hand. The driver had tipped his hat with a look that was more pity than kindness before he left her there, and now there was nothing but silence, broken by the creak of the ranch gate ahead and the restless lowing of cattle in the distance. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the spring sun was warm, because the emptiness pressed against her more sharply than any chill ever could. The Marston ranch stretched across the land, fence lines disappearing into fields that rolled toward the far blue line of mountains. The buildings looked sturdy but worn, their wood darkened by weather, the paint long stripped away. Smoke rose in thin curls from the chimney of the main house, the only sign of life she could see. Clara pressed the letter to her chest for courage, the words of the pastor's wife, who had written it echoing in her mind, a plea that someone might give her a chance, that her character could speak louder than her losses. She picked up her trunk and walked forward, her boots crunching on gravel. With each step she thought of the home she had left behind, the rooms emptied by debt collectors, the whispers that had followed her after her husband's death. Widow Dawes, pitiful, alone, a burden. She had endured it until she could endure no more, until the shame of staying felt heavier than the risk of leaving. She had boarded the coach with what little money she had saved, clinging to the hope that the West might hold a place where she was not judged by her past. A boy's laugh rang out suddenly, startling her. She turned to see a child near the barn chasing after a stray dog, his golden hair falling into his eyes as he stumbled over the grass. The sound was bright, pure, so unexpected that Clara's throat tightened. She had dreamed once of children of her own, but that dream had been buried with her husband. The boy stopped when he saw her, his small body stiffening, suspicion flashing in his eyes. Then, quick as a rabbit, he darted into the barn, the door banging shut behind him. Moments later, a man appeared in his place. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his shirt sleeves rolled, a hat shadowing a face marked by a thin scar along his jaw. His eyes were hard, not cruel but guarded, as if he had long ago taught himself to trust no one. He studied her in silence, the weight of his gaze heavy enough to still her steps. "You're standing on Marston land," he said at last, his voice deep, steady, carrying no warmth. Clara lifted the letter in her hand, holding it out, though her pulse quickened. "I was told this was a place I might find work," she answered. "I can cook, I can keep house, I can help with whatever is needed." The man took the paper, glanced at it, then gave it back without a word. Clara held his gaze, refusing to let herself shrink under it, though loneliness pressed hard against her ribs. She had nowhere else to go, and he must have seen it, for after a long pause he gave a short nod. "You can stay for now," he said. Clara breathed out slowly, the air sharp with dust and pine, and stepped through the ranch gate. She did not know if she would be welcome, but it was a beginning, and for the first time since she left Missouri, she allowed herself to believe she had not made a mistake. Luke Marston watched Clara carry her small trunk across the yard, with a stride that looked steadier than he expected, though he could see how tightly her hands clutched the handle. He had not wanted this, had not asked for anyone to come. But Thomas down in town had pressed the letter on him, and now here she was, standing in his yard, with the sky wide open above her, and no place else to turn. He had half a mind to send her on her way, but the image of his son, sitting alone at the kitchen table every evening, silent and restless, kept him from saying the words. He told himself it would be simple. She would cook, she would clean, she would tend to the small tasks that kept the house running while he worked the herd. It was a business arrangement, nothing more. His life had been pared down to the basics since the day his wife had died, and he had no interest in filling it with softness or conversation. He needed order, not sentiment. Clara seemed to understand. She asked no questions, made no demands. When he showed her the small room off the kitchen where she could sleep, she only nodded and set her trunk down. The space was plain: a narrow bed, a small table, a cracked pitcher for water. She did not complain, not even with her eyes. Instead, she removed her bonnet, smoothed her dark hair, and asked what hour he preferred supper. Her voice was calm, her manner steady, and Luke felt a faint unease, as though this woman carried something he could not quite name. That evening she cooked stew from the stores he had nearly forgotten were there. The smell filled the kitchen, rich and warm, and Luke found himself sitting at the table with his son, as though it were a habit rather than an accident. The boy, Samuel, ate quietly at first, his small hands careful on the spoon, but before the meal was done, he looked up at Clara and asked if she would be here tomorrow. She smiled gently and told him she would. Luke felt the words tighten in his chest, though he kept his face blank. After supper, Clara washed the dishes, humming under her breath, a tune Luke did not recognize. The sound drifted through the house like a ghost of something long lost, and he almost told her to stop. But Samuel sat at her side, his small face tilted upward, listening as though the tune had opened a door. Luke turned away, unsettled by the sight, and went out to the barn to finish chores that did not need doing. When he returned, the house was quiet, the lamp in the kitchen dim. Clara had retired to her room, Samuel already asleep upstairs. Luke stood in the doorway for a long time, staring at the faint glow from beneath her door. He reminded himself that this was temporary, that she was here only because he had allowed it, not because he wanted it. He had buried his wife with his heart, and no stranger with a letter and a steady gaze would change that. Still, as he climbed the stairs to his son's room, he could not shake the image of Samuel smiling over stew, a smile he had not seen in months, and the echo of a woman's voice humming softly in the dark. Clara rose before the sun most mornings, lighting the stove and setting the kettle to boil, while the house still rested in quiet. She moved through her chores with a kind of calm determination, sweeping the floors, mending worn curtains, polishing the table until the wood showed a faint shine. None of it was grand, but the small changes began to gather like sunlight creeping into corners, long dark. Luke noticed, though he told himself he did not care. A home did not need flowers in a chipped jar or the scent of bread baking to keep it standing. But each evening, when he stepped in from the yard and the air smelled of stew or biscuits, he felt something loosen in him all the same. Samuel took to Clara quickly, though Luke tried to remind himself it was only because the boy had been lonely. One afternoon she brought out a slate she had tucked into her trunk and set Samuel at the table with a stub of chalk. She traced letters, her hand steady and graceful, then guided his smaller hand to follow. His tongue stuck out in concentration as he copied the lines, and when he managed a crooked S, she praised him warmly. Luke stood in the doorway, arms crossed, telling himself it was nothing unusual, yet the sound of his boy laughing at his own clumsy letters caught him off guard. Clara taught him songs too, soft tunes she said her mother had sung when she was small. Her voice was not polished, but it was warm, wrapping the words in comfort. Samuel hummed along at first, shy and uncertain, then sang outright, his voice high and eager. Luke listened from the porch one evening, the sound drifting out the open window. It stirred memories he had kept buried deep, of nights long ago when another voice had filled this house. He clenched his jaw, refusing to let the ache swallow him. But he did not walk away. He sat there, silent, until the last note faded. As days turned into weeks, the ranch settled into a rhythm Clara helped steady. Luke worked the cattle, mended fences, hauled hay, while Clara kept the kitchen warm, the laundry done, and Samuel occupied with lessons. At supper she asked small questions about the herd, about the weather, and though Luke answered in short words, she did not press. Her patience was disarming, her quiet presence harder to ignore than any chatter might have been. Still, Luke held himself apart. When he caught her laughing with Samuel as they kneaded dough, flour dusting both their faces, he turned away quickly, unwilling to admit the sight stirred something in him. At night, when the fire burned low, he would hear her humming as she sewed by lamplight, a sound that settled into the walls of the house, as if it belonged there. He told himself it was nothing, only a woman doing her work, but the house no longer felt hollow, and the boy no longer sat silent at the table. Life on the ranch was still hard, the days long and the work unending. Yet with Clara, there was a steadiness Luke had not expected. He resisted it, kept his words guarded, his heart closed, but some part of him knew the truth. The house had begun to feel alive again, and that was her doing. The night was cool, the kind of night when the sky stretched so wide and full of stars it felt as if the whole world might fall into it. Luke sat on the porch with his boots propped on the rail, a cup of coffee cooling in his hand. Clara came out quietly, carrying her mending, and settled into the chair across from him. For a while they said nothing, listening to the crickets in the grass and the faint rustle of cattle moving in the pasture. Silence between them had become easier, less like a wall, and more like a blanket. But tonight it seemed to press with unspoken weight. It was Luke who broke it first. He stared into the dark yard and said, almost to himself, "She died here." Clara looked up, her needle stilled in her lap. He did not glance at her, his jaw tight, his voice flat. "My wife, Mary." The boy came early, and the doctor was 3 hours away. I tried to help, but nothing I did mattered. She bled until there was nothing left. He swallowed hard, the words dragging out of him like stones from deep water. I buried her behind the orchard with my own hands. For a long time after, I thought I should have gone into that ground with her. Clara's heart ached at the rawness beneath his steady tone. She laid her sewing aside and folded her hands, giving him her full attention. Luke finally looked at her, his eyes glinting in the lamplight spilling from the window. Since then, it has just been me and the boy. I swore I would never ask another woman to carry what she carried. It broke her, and it near broke me. His gaze shifted back to the dark yard. I meant to keep the house empty forever. For a long moment, the only sound was the creak of the porch boards under the shifting night wind. Then Clara drew a breath, her voice low but steady. "I lost a husband too, though not in the same way." She twisted her hands together, forcing herself to speak. "James took sick with fever one winter, and within 2 days he was gone." She paused, the memory sharp even now. "He left me with debts I never knew of, debts that took our home, our belongings, everything we had. Friends who had called themselves kind turned their backs." She shook her head slowly. "I had nothing left but shame. The whispers followed me everywhere until I could no longer bear them. That is why I came west, to start again where no one knows me." Luke listened, his expression unreadable, though his shoulders eased slightly. "Different paths, same end," he said quietly. "Left alone, carrying more than we should have to." Clara nodded. "It changes you," she whispered. "It hardens some things, but softens others." They sat in silence again, but this time it was not heavy. It was the kind of silence that comes after truth, when both know more than they had before. Luke shifted in his chair, set his cup down, and looked at her with a steadiness that carried something new. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of it. Clara held his gaze, and for the first time since she had arrived, she felt as though the space between them had begun to narrow. Spring settled over the valley in soft green and gold, the air warming, the earth loosening beneath the hooves of the cattle. Clara moved through the days with a rhythm now, her hands steady in the kitchen, her voice light as she guided Samuel through his lessons. The boy laughed more often, the sound quick and full, carrying across the yard like music. Sometimes he laughed so hard he tipped from his stool, and Clara caught him, her own laughter mingling with his, until the house itself seemed brighter. Luke would watch from the doorway, his mouth set in its usual line, though his eyes betrayed something softer. He never said a word, but sometimes the corner of his lips curved almost into a smile. Evenings grew easier, the weight of silence shifting into something more comfortable. After chores and supper, they would gather by the hearth. Samuel stretched on the rug with his slate, Clara sewing by lamplight, and Luke carving small shapes from scraps of wood. The fire crackled, shadows played against the walls, and for the first time in years, the house felt less like a tomb and more like a place meant to be lived in. One night, Clara read aloud from a worn book she had carried all the way from Missouri. Her voice filled the room, steady and warm, while Samuel listened with wide eyes. Luke sat in his chair, pretending to focus on his carving, but his gaze kept drifting to her. The lamplight brushed against her hair, turning the strands a deep chestnut glow, and when she glanced up and caught him looking, a faint flush rose in her cheeks. Neither spoke of it, but when she returned to her reading, her voice carried a tremor that had not been there before. The days outside the house began to echo the same change. Clara planted herbs by the kitchen door, and Samuel helped her, his small hands digging eagerly in the soil. Luke passed by with a load of firewood and paused, watching them. Clara brushed the dirt from Samuel's cheek with gentle fingers, laughing softly when he wrinkled his nose. Luke shifted his grip on the wood, his throat tightening with something he could not quite name. He carried the wood inside without a word, but the sound of their laughter stayed with him long after. At supper, Samuel sometimes teased Luke, telling him Clara's bread was better than his father's biscuits. Clara scolded lightly, but Luke surprised himself by chuckling, a sound low and rough as though unused. Samuel grinned wide, and Clara looked at Luke with a smile she quickly tried to hide. It was a small moment, yet it hung in the air like a thread binding them closer. Neither of them dared to speak of what was growing. Not yet. Luke kept his walls high, reminding himself that affection could turn to grief in a single night. Clara guarded her heart too, fearing the sting of rejection, of being told she was unwanted again. But each evening as the fire burned low and Samuel drifted to sleep, they found themselves sitting longer, sharing glances that lingered, small smiles that slipped free, silences that felt less like absence and more like promise. Something was stirring between them, fragile as new grass, but strong enough to take root. The trip into town began under a bright sun, but Clara felt the weight of shadows long before they reached the first storefront. She rode in the wagon beside Luke, Samuel between them, the boy chattering about the tin whistle Clara had promised to find for him. Luke said little, as always, his eyes fixed ahead, his hands steady on the reins. Clara kept her smile for Samuel's sake, though unease coiled in her chest. She had felt the looks before, the sharp glances from women outside the mercantile, the low voices that quieted when she walked by. But today it seemed sharper, like the whole town had decided to lean closer and whisper. When they stepped down from the wagon, Clara helped Samuel adjust his hat, smoothing the curls from his forehead. A pair of women standing on the boardwalk watched with eyes narrowed, one leaning close to the other with a smirk. Widow Dawes, the schemer, she heard one mutter, not softly enough. Moving in on Marston, aiming for his land. Clara's cheeks flushed, but she held Samuel's hand and guided him inside the mercantile. The air smelled of flour and lamp oil, but the comfort of familiarity did not reach her. She felt eyes following her as she walked the narrow aisles. The clerk greeted Luke with respect, but his gaze slid over Clara, cool and disapproving. She bought her thread and sugar without hesitation, though her fingers trembled as she counted the coins. Behind her, two ranchers spoke low, but their voices carried. "Poor Marston," one said. "She will ruin his good name before long." The other chuckled. "Already got her claws in. Mark me." By the time she stepped outside, the sting of their words clung to her skin like dust. Luke was tightening the straps on the wagon, his face unreadable, but she saw how stiff his shoulders were. He had heard. He said nothing on the ride home, the silence heavier than usual. And though Samuel hummed with excitement over the whistle Clara had found, the air between her and Luke felt colder than the mountain wind. That evening the quiet stretched long across the supper table. Samuel ate happily, showing off the first notes he could blow, but Luke kept his gaze fixed on his plate. Clara tried to speak of the weather, of the calves she had seen near the pasture, but his answers were short, clipped, as though he were speaking only to fill the air. At last she fell silent, her appetite gone, her hands folding tightly in her lap. Later, when Samuel had gone to bed, Luke lingered by the fire, his jaw tight. Clara sat across from him, sewing in her lap, though she could not see the needle through the blur in her eyes. At length he said, his voice low, "People talk." She looked up, heart hammering. "They always do," she answered softly. His gaze was steady, shadowed with doubt. "It matters when they are talking about my name, about my boy." Clara's chest ached. but she did not flinch. "I came here for work, Luke, not to take anything from you." He said nothing more, only looked away into the fire, the silence between them sharper now than any words could be. Clara sat very still, knowing the whispers from town had reached deeper than she feared, and wondering if the fragile life they had built was already beginning to crack. The afternoon sun hung heavy over the pasture, warming the earth until the air shimmered above the grass. Samuel had begged to ride, his small face bright with excitement as he carried the saddle blanket in his arms. Luke had agreed at last, though only with his steady hand on the reins. Clara stood at the fence, her heart tugging between pride and fear as she watched the boy mount the gentle bay gelding that had been his mother's horse long ago. The animal moved slowly under Luke's guidance, circling the corral with Samuel clutching the pommel, grinning with each step. Clara laughed with him, her hands tight on the fence rail, until the dog barked suddenly, and a spooked colt near the gate reared high. In the commotion, the gelding shied, pulling the reins from Luke's grasp. Samuel cried out as the horse bolted through the open gate, hooves thundering across the field. Luke shouted, his voice fierce, and sprinted after them, but the gelding was fast, its ears pinned back, its stride stretching further with each desperate bound. Samuel clung to the saddle, his small body bouncing dangerously. Clara felt the blood drain from her face, her heart lurching into her throat. Without thought, without caution, she climbed the fence and ran. The field blurred before her, the sound of hooves pounding like thunder in her ears. Samuel screamed again, his voice high with terror. Clara's skirts tangled at her ankles, but she pushed harder, her breath burning in her chest. She angled toward the creek at the edge of the pasture, where she knew the gelding might stumble. Reaching for the bridle, as the horse surged past, she grasped leather with both hands and was nearly flung from her feet. The force dragged her through the dust, her boots scraping hard earth, but she clung fast, calling Samuel's name with all the strength in her voice. The gelding fought, wild-eyed, but Clara pulled with every ounce of strength, jerking the bit hard. The horse skidded, Samuel slipping sideways from the saddle. Clara lunged forward, arms outstretched, and caught him as he slid, her body crashing into the ground with his weight against her. The impact drove the breath from her lungs, pain flashing through her ribs, but she held him tight, shielding him as the gelding bolted free across the pasture. Luke reached them moments later, his face ashen, his breath ragged. He dropped to his knees, his hands trembling as they touched Samuel's shoulders, Clara's arm, searching for injury. Samuel sobbed into Clara's chest, clinging as though he would never let go. Clara gasped for air, her body shaking, but when she lifted her face, her eyes met Luke's. The terror in his gaze was raw, tearing through the walls he had built around himself. For a moment he looked at her as if she had pulled him from the brink too, as if the sight of her lying still in the grass would have broken him beyond repair. His voice cracked when he whispered, "I thought I lost you both." Clara drew Samuel closer, her hand brushing his curls, her voice shaking but steady enough. "You did not," she said. "We are here." The boy's sobs softened, though he would not loosen his hold. Luke's rough hand lingered against hers, his eyes searching her face as though words failed him. The moment stretched between them, full of fear, full of gratitude, full of something neither had dared to name, until the silence said it for them. Clara woke with a dull ache in her side, and the strange stillness of a room not her own. The curtains were drawn, the air carrying the faint scent of pine resin and soap. For a moment she did not remember. Then the memory came rushing back, the horse, the ground rising up hard, Samuel's small body pressed against hers as she shielded him. She tried to sit, but a sharp pain in her ribs forced her back against the pillow. The door creaked, and Luke stepped in with a bowl of broth, his rough hands careful as he set it on the table. "You should not move," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Clara's lips curved faintly. "I am not one to lie idle, Mr. Marston." His eyes flickered, something unspoken there, before he pulled a chair close and sat her. "Samuel is safe," he added, as if knowing the first thought in her mind. Clara let out a slow breath of relief, her eyes closing briefly. "Thank God," she whispered. Over the next days, Luke tended her with a steadiness that surprised them both. He brought water, stoked the fire, even folded the quilt at her feet when it slipped. His hands, calloused from work, moved gently when he helped her sit or adjusted the pillows. Clara watched him sometimes when he thought she slept, saw the furrow in his brow, the way his gaze lingered on her face, as though weighing something he could not say. One evening, as the sun bled red across the sky, she stirred awake to find him sitting at her bedside, Samuel asleep against his shoulder. The boy's small hand clutched Luke's shirt, and Luke sat motionless, afraid to disturb him. The sight made Clara's chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with her ribs. "You look at him like he's all you have," she said softly. Luke's gaze snapped to her, startled, then softened. "He is," he answered simply. Clara wanted to tell him that he had more, that he was more than the hollow man grief had made him, but the words caught in her throat. She pressed her palm lightly to her side, steadying herself. Instead, she said, "Samuel has your strength." Luke studied her for a long moment. "He has yours too," he murmured. Respect deepened between them, quiet but undeniable. Luke could not ignore how she had thrown herself into danger without hesitation, how she had taken the boy into her arms as if he were her own. Clara could not deny the gentleness beneath his stern manner, the care he gave without asking for recognition. Yet both kept silent about what stirred beneath. Luke feared the ache of loss more than he longed for the hope of love, and Clara feared offering her heart only to have it turned away as it once had been. When she was strong enough to walk again, Clara stepped out into the yard, the evening air cool against her face. Luke was mending a fence nearby, his hammer steady. He glanced up, and for a moment their eyes held, an entire conversation unspoken. Then he bent back to his work, and Clara lowered her gaze. The silence between them was no longer empty, but filled with the weight of what neither dared name, fragile and dangerous, as the hope rising quietly inside them both. The letter came folded neat in the pocket of the storekeeper's ledger, handed to Clara with a polite smile that did not reach his eyes. She read it standing outside the mercantile, the spring wind tugging at her bonnet strings. The town council was seeking a schoolteacher, someone steady, someone with references, someone to bring order to the one-room schoolhouse at the edge of Hollow Creek. Her name had been suggested. A proper post, with a wage and respect, a roof above her that belonged to her alone. Clara read the words twice, then folded the letter slowly, as if pressing its weight deeper into her palm. On the wagon ride home, she tucked it in her satchel, but the words clung to her all the same. A life where people would look at her not with suspicion but with gratitude, where whispers would fade into nods of respect. She thought of the long road she had taken west, of the shame she had carried, and for a moment, the offer felt like the answer to all she had prayed for. Yet when she glanced across the wagon seat at Samuel, his small hands clutching the whistle she had given him, her heart twisted. At supper, she said nothing, only served stew and bread as usual. Luke sat across from her, his expression unreadable as he spoke to Samuel about the calves in the north pasture. Clara studied the lines of his face, the scar along his jaw, the steadiness of his hands as he broke his bread. He had been kinder since the accident, watching her with a quietness that felt like gratitude, yet he had never spoken beyond necessity. He had never said she belonged. That night, while Samuel slept upstairs, Clara sat by the fire with the letter in her lap. Luke entered, the smell of smoke and cattle clinging to him, and paused when he saw her. She lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes, then looked down again. "A letter came today," she said softly. "They need a schoolteacher in town." Luke's jaw tightened, though he kept his voice flat. "A respectable post, safer than this." He left the words hanging, unfinished, but the meaning was plain. "Do you want me to go?" she asked, her voice steady, though her hands trembled against the folded paper. He did not answer at once. He stared into the fire, the light carving hard shadows across his face. "What you choose is yours to choose," he said at last. Clara turned the letter over and over in her hands, her heart heavy. She wanted him to tell her to stay, to say that Samuel's laughter and the warmth she had tried to bring meant something more. But Luke only stood there, guarded as ever, silent in the way that kept her on the outside. Later, alone in her small room, she packed the letter carefully into her trunk. Her eyes stung, but she told herself this was what she had always wanted: stability, respect, a place among people who would see her as worthy. Still, as she blew out the lamp and lay in the darkness, she felt the silence of the house pressing around her. And it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of something precious, slipping away. The morning of market day was clear and sharp. The sky stretched wide over Hollow Creek. Clara rode into town on the wagon seat beside Luke, Samuel between them, chattering about the penny candy he hoped to buy. In her satchel, the letter of offer from the schoolhouse rustled against the fabric, its weight pressing like a secret she could not keep much longer. She glanced at Luke, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, stern as always. But she saw the strain in the set of his jaw, the way his hands gripped the reins tighter than needed. Whispers followed them the moment they set foot on the boardwalk. Women in bonnets paused at the dressmaker's door. Ranchers leaning against posts fell quiet. Widow Dawes, still here, still chasing after Marston's land? One muttered, her voice sharp as a needle. Another clucked her tongue. He ought to send her packing before his good name is ruined. Clara lifted her chin, determined not to falter, but Samuel heard enough to tug at her hand and ask in a small voice why folks were frowning. She hushed him gently, her heart burning. Inside the mercantile, Clara busied herself with sugar and flour, while Luke spoke with the storekeeper. She could feel the eyes on her back, the judgment that had never softened. At last she turned, meaning to walk out, when Luke's voice stopped her. It carried not in anger but in rough honesty, loud enough for every ear in the room. "I know what you say," he told the crowd, his gaze sweeping over them. "That she came here to trap me, to steal a name, to use my boy." His hand curled into a fist before he forced it open. "You think I don't hear it, but I do." The room stilled, all eyes fixed on him. He turned toward Clara, and for the first time she saw fear in his eyes, not of the town, but of her. "I swore I'd never love again," he said, voice low but steady. "I swore it because burying my wife near broke me, and I thought if I kept my heart shut, I'd never feel that kind of loss again. But when you ran after my boy, when I saw you holding him like he was yours, I knew the truth." His voice cracked, his chest rising hard with breath. "I cannot bear to lose you, Clara. Not to River, not to town, not to anything." Clara's throat tightened, her eyes burning. She saw the shock on the faces around them, the women clutching their shawls, the men shifting uncomfortably, the whispers dying into silence. She stepped forward, her voice clear as the bell that rang on Sundays. "I did not come here to take land or name. I came with nothing, hoping only for work. What I found was a boy who needed laughter again, and a man who needed someone to remind him he was not alone." Her hand trembled, but she held Luke's gaze. "I choose him. I choose this ranch. I choose this life." Samuel slipped his small hand into hers, looking up with a smile that held no doubt. Around them the townsfolk shifted, some frowning still, some softening, but none could ignore the truth laid bare. Luke reached for Clara's hand, rough fingers closing over hers in a grip steady and sure. For once he did not hide, did not turn away. Before all who had doubted, they stood side by side, no longer bound by whispers, but by choice. The first light of dawn spread slowly across the valley, spilling gold over the grass, still damp with night, and setting the distant peaks aglow with fire. Clara stood at the ranch gate, the wood cool beneath her hand, the air carrying the scent of pine and earth freshly turned. Beside her, Samuel leaned against her skirt, his whistle dangling from a string around his neck, his eyes wide with the wonder only a child could keep. Luke stood close on her other side, tall and steady, his hat brim shadowing his face, though the light revealed the softer look in his eyes. For a moment none of them spoke, listening instead to the quiet that always came before the work of the day. It was not the silence of loss, not any more, but the silence of belonging. The fields stretched wide before them, the fences needing mending, the cattle waiting to be driven out to graze. The house behind them showed the marks of years and storms, yet smoke rose from the chimney, warm and alive. Clara saw it all, with a heart steady and full, the hardships clear, but no longer heavy. She had carried loneliness, shame, and hunger through the long road west. But here, standing between a man and his son who had claimed her as their own, she felt only peace. Luke shifted, resting one rough hand against the top rail of the gate. His voice was quiet, but certain. Hard days will come, Clara. Storms, drought, the kind of troubles that can tear a place down. She looked up at him, her smile calm and sure. I know, she said, but I also know we'll face them together. He studied her face, as though weighing the truth of her words, then gave a single nod. The gesture was small, but it carried more weight than any vow. Samuel blew a soft note on his whistle, the sound thin and wobbly but proud. Both adults laughed, and Clara bent to kiss the crown of his curls. Luke's eyes softened further, and he reached out, brushing his hand across Samuel's shoulder before letting it fall gently over Clara's. The three of them stood linked in the glow of morning, not perfect, not untouched by sorrow, but bound by choice. The future stretched as wide as the sky above the Montana hills, fragile in ways, strong in others. Clara could see it in glimpses, years of teaching Samuel his letters, of kneading bread with laughter in the kitchen, of evenings by the fire where silence would no longer feel empty. She saw Luke's shoulders easing, his heart no longer carrying grief alone, his scar not a mark of loss but of survival. She saw a family, not made by chance but by courage and the willingness to love again. Thank you for walking this trail with Clara, Luke, and Samuel. If their story touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe to Western Love Legends, like this tale, and share your thoughts in the comments. After all, the West holds endless stories of love and grit, and we'd be glad to ride them together. And between us, Samuel swears he's going to practice that whistle every sunrise so we may need stronger coffee.